Hello and welcome to QubaHQ tutorials. My name is Kuba Michalski and today I'm going to show you how to conquer one of the great demons of motion graphics, namely the depth of field in Cinema 4D. Setting up and controlling the depth of field inside Cinema is a somewhat awkward procedure and it's nearly guaranteed to cause headaches to all the newcomers to this software. Hopefully the solution that I'm about to present you with will eliminate the needless stress and frustration that I and so many others have experienced in the past. The idea for this tutorial came to me a few days ago when John Dickinson of the Australian site MotionWorks released a very helpful post entitled Cinema 4D Depth of Field Quick Reference Guide. In this post he presents us with a graph explaining how does Cinema 4D camera work and what do the values that you enter while setting up depth of field mean and how to use them properly. The post was very warmly received. I myself was very happy to see it, but after a moment I thought to myself, wait a second, why do we need such posts? Why can't the controls of Cinema 4D camera be intuitive enough for everyone to figure it out on their own? Is there anything I could do to improve the user experience while controlling depth of field in Cinema 4D? The answer, unfortunately, was no. Cinema 4D uses Espresso as its primary expression language, and honestly speaking, I have no bloody idea how to use it. Fortunately, a friend of mine does. I contacted Derya Ozturk, also known as Jader, a German motion graphics and art director who is quite versatile in Cinema 4D, and asked him to help me with this. Over the course of few days we developed a new depth of field camera rig for Cinema 4D, which I'm about to present you with today. But first things first, let's try to use Cinema 4D without any additional modules or presets and see what happens when we try to create nice looking depth of field, either produced in Cinema or post-produced in After Effects. I have the Cinema 4D version 12 open in here, but you can follow along in version 11.5 as well. The preset will work for both versions. First of all, in project settings, let me quickly set up my frame rate to 25 and quickly switch the render settings to the proper document size. So I'm going to disable save for now, go to output and choose the film video preset HDVC Pro HD 720, where the hell is it? 25 frames a second. I'm going to build a very simple scene in here, nothing artistic, just something that will help us observe the changes in depth of field as we work with the camera. So I'm going to start by creating a box, change its dimensions to 100 by 100 by 100 and quickly create a texture for it. And from my photography classes at the university long time ago, I remember those boxes with a checkerboard pattern on them. So I'm going to use something like that, maybe increase the amount of repetitions on the pattern just to make it a little bit more detailed. So let me open the checkerboard and change the U and V frequency to 2. So we end up with a 4x4 checkerboard on each side. Now I'm going to take this cube and drop it inside of a MoGraph cloner. There we go. And create a long line of those cubes that will help us see the depth of field as they go far into distance. So I'm going to need around 30 of them. They shouldn't be offset vertically, but instead horizontally in the Z space, and I think the spacing between them could be around 150. So this is looking quite nice. This is the center of my document right now, so I'm just going to offset it. I can even type the value in here by minus 1500 and maybe just add one more so they are nice and symmetric in here. Alright, so we have our setup. You know what, let's add a quick floor and light to this thing as well. So for the cubes not to clip with the floor, I'm going to move them a little bit up, and I see somehow I already managed to move them somewhere, so let me quickly zero the X and Y values and type this one in again, and then move it up by 50. So that's the half of the size, and the bottom of the cubes is resting exactly on our plane. Let's add a floor. There it is, and since it's a floor object, although we see a limited size, it will become an infinite one. And maybe create a quick shader for it, nothing fancy, just a pure white color so it receives the shadows a bit nicer, and add a quick light. So new light, that's a standard Omni light. Bring it a bit higher and make sure that all the sides are nicely illuminated. There we go. We can also add a bit of a shadow. I'm going to use Shadow Maps soft shadow for this and increase the resolution into 1000 so they're not quite so blurry. Alright, let's create a new camera in here. So we go to the camera, and of course it's created exactly in the spot where our preview was, so I need to enable it right now and position it in the place. I'm going to select my cloner as I rotate the camera so it will become the pivot point around which our camera rotates, and I think somewhere around here should be just fine. Alright, so if I do a quick render in here, this is how my scene looks. The shadows could be better, but I'm not going to complain much about it. We see all the cubes in perfect sharpness. What I can see though is I think I did not set any anti-aliasing for this scene. So let me very quickly go to my render settings, go to anti-aliasing and switch it to best. Now normally I would probably spend a bit more time optimizing this thing, but for now I just want quick results, and the geometry isn't really that complicated, so it's still gonna render really quickly. So as you can see, at this point we have absolutely no depth of field in here. Everything is in focus, from the objects right in front of the camera to the ones far in the end. So let's set it up, and that's a multi-step process. Let me walk you through it very quickly. First of all, we need to select our camera and go to the depth panel in its attributes, and you can see that we already have the target distance, but the front and rear blur are switched off. So I'm gonna turn them on right now. And what these values say is we are focusing 2000 centimeters from the camera, and immediately from this area we start blurring. So our depth of field is effectively only 1 pixel thick, or should I say 1 pixel thin. And over the course of 1000 centimeters, which may seem like a large number, but it's actually not so huge distance in Cinema 4D, we're increasing the blur from perfectly sharp image to completely blurred. And how we control how much it blurs is in the render options. But before we go there, let me just turn off the camera view in here and rotate our image so we can see what's happening. So this is our focal point, and these two are the fall off of our blur. So everything is sharp on this bright green rectangle plane and gradually becomes more and more blurred until it reaches the end, and from then on everything is blurred to the maximum. And the same thing happens in front of the camera. If I quickly render this, you'll see that nothing has changed, everything is still sharp. And that's because our depth of field is not yet enabled in render options. So let's go there now, open the render options, and from Effect, choose Depth of Field. Now, if I do this, Cinema 4D is going to basically render the depth of field as it pleases. Although we entered all these values in our camera properties, or actually we're choosing the default ones, but even if we enter some, it doesn't matter. It will do whatever it wants. So let me just show you what happens. Let's quickly render this thing, this time in external viewer. And for some reason it opens on another monitor. Let me just quickly move it in. So you can see just around here everything is sharp, and then it gradually blurs towards the front and towards back. Maybe I can increase the blur strength a little bit more to 10% to exaggerate effect a little bit. And let me try to arrange those windows so that everything is a bit easier to see. Typically I work with 2 monitor setups, so every now and then the panels open on the other monitor where all the recording software sits at the moment. Let's do another render. As you can see right now we have a very strong blur. This may look like you know, what is this guy talking about? This looks really nice. It's all very pretty. It blurs nicely. Why is he complaining? Okay, what I don't like in here is that my area of focus, my sharp area, is very, very thin. Stuff becomes blurred very quickly, and if I wanted to keep more of those boxes in focus, this wouldn't work for me. So let's hide this for a moment and modify our camera settings. So the start value for front and rear blur are the distance from the original target that will keep everything in focus. Let's increase it. Let's say that I want to have 500 pixels more of a sharp area in front and 500 pixels, actually centimeters, in the back. Let's render this and see what happens. So as you can see, the depth of field is a post effect. It first renders the image sharp and then applies the depth of field. So we have a render, but I don't see any difference. If I compare the previous image, and I have a history in here, you can see that both of them are absolutely identical. Now, this is starting to become a bit fishy. I mean, I just entered some values. Why isn't the render changing? Let's look at it from the side. We don't have any indicators for start of the front and rear blur, so I don't really know what's happening. But let's exaggerate these values a little bit. So we know that this is 1000 pixels because we can control it directly. So let's move our sharp area all the way to 1000 and then make it blur over another 1000 pixels and do the same time for the rear blur. So 1000 and 2000. So right now, until approximately halfway through, things should be sharp in here and then fall off. Okay, back to the camera view, render this thing. What the hell? It's again the same. Look, this is our new render, previous render, original render. Cinema 4D will completely ignore your settings until you enable somewhat cryptic use gradients option in the depth of field panel on render settings. So let's turn this on, and I can tell you the results are gonna surprise you. So if I render this thing right now, look what happens to the blur, how strong it becomes. It's actually quite slow. It's still calculating the front blur right now. Is it actually? No, it's not. Okay, the front blur has moved so far that it's not even visible. Let me quickly bring it back to, let's say, 500, 1000, 500, 1000. Okay, render again. You see what's happening? This blur is just absolutely insane right now. And we're at just 10%. I'm going to lower it to 2, and I think that should give us a little bit of a nicer result. Let's make one more render. Alright, so it starts working right now, right? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, almost 10 boxes in focus before it starts blurring. But it's really, really tough to set up, because even when I look from the perspective view, I cannot really see where is my area of full focus. I only see the fall off, but it never presents me with the graphical representation of what's sharp and what's not. Maybe if setting up depth of field in Cinema 4D is not so user-friendly, I should just export the depth map and do it in post, do it in After Effects. I have some really good plugins that create beautiful depth of field effects. Why don't we try that? Before we do that though, let me just quickly clean up the scene a little bit. I'm going to grab my light, my floor and the cloner and group them into a new null and call it scene. So we can easily see all the scene assets sitting inside of this box and the camera being separate. So what we're going to do now is we're going to keep our settings for the blur. Let's render it one more time, this time in this viewer. So this is the end result we're aiming for. We know where's the start, where's the end, etc, etc. But we're going to disable rendering of depth of field in here and instead create a depth matte. So to do that, we need to enable multipass rendering and also saving of the files. We'll go to multipass and locate the depth map, and that's at the very bottom of the list. Let's also make sure that we're working in proper 16-bit resolution for all the renders. So I'm going to go to the save option, find a place to save our stuff. Ignore this. This could give you some hints on the upcoming tutorials, but let's not talk about it yet. And let's quickly... Actually, I need those folders, damn it. No, I don't. Let's quickly save the file as demo original, because we're using the original Cinema 4D camera in here. And I want to render stuff as TIFF in 16 bits per channel. Normally I would use alpha channel, but I don't need it right now. For multipass image, we go to the same folder again, set damn it, I already forgot what was the name of my file. Demo original. Demo original, and I want this to be a TIFF as well, and I don't want a multi-layer file. I want it to render all the files separately and use the layer name as the suffix. Finally, I'll want my compositing file for After Effects using relative and including 3D data. Alright, so I can immediately save the project file, and I'm in the wrong folder in here. So let's go to demos and again call it, God, my memory is great, demo original. And do a quick render. I mean, just one frame, we're not doing any animation in here. So we close this, hit render, and there it is. And if we look at the layers right now, we have our background, and then we have our depth. And those of you who worked with depth of field before will already notice that something's fishy about it. But for now, let's ignore it. Let's go to After Effects and try to work with it. So okay, let's open After Effects, and since I'm not distributing all these project files this time, I'm just giving you the preset. You can do with it whatever you want. I'm going to use After Effects CS5, which I'm much more comfortable with. Remember, in order to import Cinema 4D files, you will need to install a plugin which comes with your distribution of Cinema. So I'm going to open the demo original AEC file, and that's going to create a new composition for me called Demo Shot Tutorial, and that's the name of my file. If I open it, I can see that I have my image, I have my camera, and I have the light, and I can maybe extend it to the full length of composition even. So those are going to help me composite additional files. And let's see if it imported my depth. Yes, it did. So in special passes, I have my depth image. So let's drop it into the composition as well. So here it is. This is my depth image. And let's try applying depth of field effect on it. So I'm going to select my demo original, and if you have the Frischluft plugins, use them definitely. Otherwise, you can use the camera blur that comes with After Effects. It's a fairly decent effect, but it's damn slow to render. So I'm going to stick to my Frischluft, apply depth of field, and in here, I can also switch my bit depth to 16, since all my images are 16 bit. And in here I can define my depth layer. So demo original depth is the depth layer. Okay, at this point I can start increasing the blur, and we can already see something weird is happening. Okay, just for a moment I'm going to pretend everything is okay and click in the middle where our camera was focused to define our focus point. So this is looking relatively nice, right? We have our sharp area. It's exactly the same depth as we defined. It's blurring much nicer than it would in Cinema 4D. And we have tons of controls that Frischluft provides us, which we don't need right now. But what if I want to change and make the focus pull? Alright, I'm not gonna move the sampler in here. I'm just going to change the value that decides which of those grays is our focus point. So that's in our focal point control, and since it was at 0, let me just zero it again. Since it was at 0, it means parts of the image that are black are in focus, and then they gradually become more and more blurred as they travel towards white, which makes sense. So let's start increasing the focal point and see what happens. Now, what the hell is this? Can you explain it to me? Look at it. Maybe I can increase the blur even further to exaggerate the effect. Alright, we have two boxes that are blurred. Then we have a box that's sharp. Then we have another area that's blurred, then sharp, then blurred. This does not make any sense whatsoever. This is completely against the laws of optics and is not how it's supposed to be. Well, the reason for that is what Cinema 4D calls the depth map isn't really a map. Let's have a look at it. What does the map mean? Map is an abstracted representation of a concept or set of values that allows us to observe something using simplified data. That's not a Wikipedia definition, that's just something I came up with, but I think it's fairly accurate. So in here we're dealing with the depth map. What would that mean? If we're mapping depth to a black and white image, then most logically the dark values could be either very close and the bright values could be very far, or vice versa. Bright is close and dark is far. So let's say white is close. We can see that everything right next to the camera is white. That means this box is close to the camera and it's getting further away. Then it becomes black, then it's really far. And then it gets closer again. This does not make any sense. Now the problem is Cinema 4D decided to create its own interpretation of how depth of field works. And because of this front and rear blur nonsense, it creates something like that. A proper depth map should have bright colors or dark colors in front and the opposite side of spectrum on the other side, and a smooth gradient going in between. This is not a depth map. This will only work if we select black. We have no control over it. So how to fix it? Let's go back to Cinema and close our preview in here. Look away from the camera and set it up. First of all, we need to get rid of front blur. Boom, it's off. Second of all, we have to move our target distance to a place that's actually not our target distance, but somewhere that is very close to the camera. Then we have to switch the start of the real blur to 0, so it sits exactly where our target distance is, and then increase the end to encompass all the other boxes. And if you hear me speaking in a funny way, that's because I really have to travel several meters with my mouse in order to increase the distance on the end of rear blur. Alright, we have this. Let's make another render, and we do want to overwrite it. Let's give it a moment to calculate. And of course I rendered it from the wrong camera. We could have waited there for hours. One more time. Yes, do overwrite it. Okay, now that's more like it. Dark in front, white in the back. Maybe I went a bit too far with my rear blur. So let me just quickly bring it back just a tiny bit. And again swinging the mouse all over the table. Alright, this should be fine. Back to the camera view, render, replace, yes. Okay, now this is something that we can work with. Now since we have save option enabled, I can just jump back to After Effects right now. Reload the footage, get the proper map. And right now when we start playing with the depth of field effect, you can see that it works as intended. We either focus really close to the camera at the black and blur travels to the rear of the image, or we can move our focal point through the different values and focus somewhere in the middle, let's say. Front is blurred, back is blurred. Or go all the way 255 to the back, well, maybe a bit too far. Let's say here. Okay, I could have adjusted the values a bit better, but you get the idea. Right now we have proper control over how does it blur. But can you imagine, let's just get rid of this right now. We don't need it. Can you imagine doing it for all your scenes every time? Let's say you set up a scene and you create everything, and then you have to test it maybe in Cinema 4D, export it into After Effects. So before you export it, you have to switch the front and rear blur, render it like this, come back to the origin. I mean, it's crazy. it's absolute nonsense and it's just making people's lives miserable. Additionally, After Effects is actually able to read depth of field out of the camera data and apply it to its own depth of field. So if we have a 3D layer in After Effects, we can make it follow the focus of the Cinema 4D camera. But since we changed everything, and right now, in order to render this map, we had to bring the focus all the way here. That will get screwed up, and basically you will usually need to work with two separate files, one with the camera set for After Effects, one for Cinema 4D, export the 3D data from one, export the image from another, depth map from the first one. Nonsense. Let me show you how to do it properly, easily, with the preset prepared for you by QubaHQ. So just to prove to you how inexperienced programmers both I and Derya are, I had to do a quick bug fix on our camera rig after recording a large portion of the tutorial because something was wrong, and now it's fixed and ready to show you. So what I did is I'm back at my scene, I removed the original Cinema 4D camera, and right now I'm going to import our rig and show you how to set it up and how it works. So let's go to File, Merge, and import our DoF camera 1.0. At this point it should probably be called 1.0.1, but doesn't matter. And there it is. You can see it here. It doesn't tell you much at this point, but let me just bring it up a little bit, and you can already see that it looks quite different from what typical Cinema 4D camera looks like. You have much more information presented in here, and this is going to help you a lot in setting up your depth of field. So with the camera comes a bunch of helper layers which are parented underneath. You can see this protection sign and the big writing saying don't touch. Try to obey this recommendation. The whole thing is still a bit shaky. If you start playing with it, it may break. The whole thing is driven by a network of espresso expressions that calculate everything for you. And let's see what it does. If you select your camera DoF right now, you will see you have a new panel called iDoF. And in here you have some more intuitive controls that will make it much easier to set up. So first of all, you have your focus. Let me collapse everything in here. You have your focus, and that's a standard setting for where are we focusing on. So let's say our focus is something around 1000. Actually, before we do that, let's move it into position. This way we can immediately see the results. So let me look through the camera, maybe select the scene or even select the cloner so it becomes my pivot point that I move around, and it didn't help much. Okay, floor. Alright, that's much better. So let's try to recreate where our original camera was. Now, if you're planning to use this rig, you will probably import it right in the beginning of your composition and will not have to try to manually set it up. We could of course copy and paste the positions of the old camera. In this aspect everything behaves exactly the same. But I think this is pretty good. We can see where we are and the image looks fairly the same. So let's jump out to perspective view, select our camera and look at the settings. So first of all, we have our focus, and we have two possible ways of focusing. One is manual, so we can just decide where our focus is, and let's say we want it around this box. Second one is to use focus object. So for that I can, for example, create a null object. Let's make it a bit more visible, maybe a circle or maybe even a sphere, and increase its size. Can we change its color? Yes, we can, but I don't remember where. This sphere can be our focus object, and let's say we'll want to focus around this area. All you need to do, select your camera DoF and drag that null into your focus object panel. Now it opened the object as well. Let's go in here, null object. Now the camera is focused at this null and I can move it around and the camera will follow it. So it's pretty much like the target of the After Effects camera. Now you may see something weird happening in here, which is our focus point moved quite far away from the point. And this is unfortunately something we couldn't figure out how to solve. So whenever you use focus object, you need to dial the focus down to 0. So focus becomes a kind of offset from our followed object. But for now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to clear this, delete it, and set it up manually. So I think our focus was around here. Second of all, we have focus depth. And this will define how wide of an area will be perfectly sharp. Actually, now that I'm looking at the scene, probably our focus should be a little bit more down the line, somewhere around here. So as I increase focus depth, I'm getting two helper planes that show me, okay, everything between these two is going to be 100% sharp. No blur is going to occur within this box. Alright, great. So let's say we want around 5 or 6 of those cubes perfectly sharp. This should do the trick. And then you have focus fall off. And focus fall off will basically help you decide how long will it take for the image to become fully blurred. So if this white plane is the end of perfectly sharp area, this gray plane is the beginning of perfectly blurred area. And in between of it, the sharpness slowly turns into blur. So this is looking relatively fine. Let's just jump to the original view, make sure that our depth of field is enabled and our saves are disabled at this point, and preview render this thing. So this is looking good, but I see that I didn't position my camera properly somehow. Yep, I managed to move it probably when I was messing around with the target object. So let's move it back into this position and render it again. Alright, so just as we set out to do, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, well, 7 focused boxes, and then it falls off into the blur. Let's play with the settings a little bit and see how we can modify it. So let's say I don't want this wide area of focus. I want everything to be blurred very quickly, and I want a very, very thin, sharp area. So I'm gonna do this, and I'm going to also decrease the fall off. So right now we should probably have one box that's in focus and very quickly go into fully blurred image. Let's render this, and it's exactly what we wanted. Well, we got 2 of them, but still, very shallow depth of field, quick fall off, and the rest is blurred. And we can compare the 2 results in the viewer looking at the history. Okay, how about something opposite? We want a very wide area that's in focus and then a very slow fall off. This slider goes only to 1000, but you can just manually type in a larger value. That's not a problem at all. Back to the camera view, render the preview, and we can barely see any blur right now. These ones are a little bit blurred, but almost everything is in focus. So you can already see how much easier setting up this thing became. Instead of trying to guess what's going to happen, imagining where your distances are, you have a nice visual representation of your scene, and it takes just a moment to get the results you want. Let's just set something that's gonna become a bit more helpful to us. So let's set the focus depth to, let's say, 500 pixels. And the fall off to, let's say, 1000. The area of focus is still nice, but maybe I'll just move it a bit closer to the camera. Let's say 3500. And again, do a quick render of that. Okay, I want these boxes to be sharper, and that's because I'm going to move to After Effects very soon. So again, come back, move the focus, and you can see everything else adjusts together with it. Let's say to 800. That should do the trick, I think. Render it. Perfect. We have our focus area, we have some blurs happening, everything looks like intended. Let's export it into After Effects and see what we can do with it. Normally, when I'm exporting into After Effects, I would render a perfectly sharp image in here and do all the blurring in post. But just for the purpose of this demonstration, I'm going to keep the Cinema 4D blur on, and we're going to switch to creating depth maps really soon. So let's go to the render settings, make sure our save is enabled. We don't need a multipass at this point. And you can see I already changed the name of the file into demo QubaHQ rig. and we're going to render as a TIFF, 16 bits per channel, and additionally we're going to render the compositing file. Save is enabled, no multipass, compositing file, I can actually save it right now. And let's render this thing. Yes, we do want to overwrite it. Okay, so this is the very same image that you've seen just a moment ago. Let's jump to After Effects now and open our QubaHQ rig AEC. And inside, as expected, you're going to see the single image, because we're not really dealing with animations right now, although the rig is perfectly capable of doing that, and the composition. And if we open the composition, we can see a bit of trash in here. Now, we couldn't figure out how to stop these helper cameras from importing, so all you need to do is just select all of them and delete, keeping only the camera DoF in your composition. Let's also extend the length of all the layers, so in case I happen to move my slider around, we won't get any blinking. Alright, so we have our scene, we have our camera. Let's see if the 3D data imported correctly. So I'm going to create a new text layer and just type QubaHQ, turn it into 3D layer and position it at 0, 0, 0, which is the center of our composition. And you can already see that it obeys the same perspective our whole composition has. And not only that, let me just scale it down a tiny bit. Not only that, but it also reacts to the lights. Cinema 4D exported its lights, so as I turn it around, it's going to change its shade, reacting to the same light that is illuminating the rest of the scene. If I want to go completely nuts in here, and why the hell not, I can also create a new white solid 500 by 500 pixels, click OK, turn it into 3D, position it at 0, 0, 0, flip it so that it lays down as the floor, minus 90, scale it up 10,000, that's good enough. And this can be our shadow receiver, but right now it accepts lights, so it looks kind of weird. Let's just go to the properties for this layer. In material options, switch off accepts lights, but keep accepts shadows. Alright. And switch the mode of it into multiply. And for our QubaHQ texts, I'm gonna enable casting shadows, so cast shadows on. And you can right now see that we're receiving shadows from our light as well. You know what, I can scale it back up a little bit, maybe move it to the side. Normally I would probably want to have another ambient light, because when imported from Cinema 4D, the overall lighting of the scene may feel a bit dark, especially if you tilt the cameras. But right now what I want to show you is the import of the depth of field. So remember, we didn't mess with the depth math right now. We didn't use our preset to its full potential yet. All we're doing is importing the actual 3D data of the camera. So let's expand the options for the camera and turn on depth of field. And it's not going to look quite right at this point. If I increase the depth of field in here and just move my object around a little bit, you'll see that the focus comes in a slightly strange spot, and that's an export error that occurs for quite unknown reason to me. It should be perfectly in focus in here, but all you need to do is open your Cinema 4D. Let's hide this. Look at your camera. The focus is at 2800. So you go back to After Effects, focus distance 2800, and right now our text is going to obey exactly the same depth of field as our Cinema 4D file. So if I move it back, it's going to blur, or at least it should. Maybe I need to increase the blur level to some ridiculous value. Alright. So it's blurred. And then it comes, wow. Then it comes into focus, and as I move it closer to the camera, it blurs again. So the export of depth of field isn't by any means perfect. As you can see, I mean, setting it to over 500, it's a bit crazy. Something like 300 is already very high, but it works. It does bring that data to us. But what about our depth maps that we were talking about? Let's tackle this right now. So I'm going to hide After Effects, go back to Cinema 4D, look from outside again, and remember what we had to do when we were switching the camera to render 4 After Effects depth map, how complex that was. Right now is just one click away. Well, actually 2 clicks. Right now we're working in Cinema 4D mode. We wrote it in here for you. This is for depth of field render, so if you're rendering depth of field in Cinema 4D, and for the camera export. We already did that, we exported our camera. Now we want to create a depth map for our Frischluft, and for that all you need to do is switch it to After Effects mode and refresh it by clicking the camera. And you can see right now it automatically adjusted. It moved the focus point. If I look at the actual object properties, no, depth properties, it moved the focus point to the front, it moved the blur to the end, made all the calculations for you. And if we go to our render settings, I just want to make sure I don't overwrite what I already exported. Turn off depth of field, turn on multipass, and let's render this. And of course I forgot to change my camera. Enable it. Render. We get a proper depth map. So this is what it's supposed to look like. This is actually very easy to demonstrate right now. If I go to our eye depth of field, I have no idea why Derya named this panel this way, but it's a good short name. Switch to C4D name, click on the camera to refresh, and render it again. This is that Cinema 4D weirdness that we experienced before. Again, switch to After Effects mode, refresh the camera, render, proper depth of field. That easy. Okay, I mean, this is absolutely awesome, at least in my humble opinion. So what I can do right now is open my render settings, make sure that I'm saving this time, but I'm gonna disable saving of the regular image. No, actually I do have to re-render it because the version we have inside After Effects at this point has already burnt in depth of field, and we don't want that. So we're gonna resave the depth of field, we're gonna resave the depth layer. Let's change the name to the proper one. 16 bits per channel. Compositing file, we don't need to change it. Everything looks fine. Render. Whoops. Render. Come on. Yes, I do want to replace it. And right now, if I go back to my After Effects, I can refresh this image, reload it. I can import my new depth image, just generate it, drop it underneath, maybe turn it off, and apply Frischluft. So Frischluft, depth of field, depth layer is our depth. Set up this spot to be in focus, increase the radius, and there we go. Beautiful depth of field, rendered in post, everything looks fine, and our 3D layer obeying exactly the same depth, slowly. Okay, maybe if I increase the aperture it will look a bit better. Actually, did it export the aperture properly? Let's just have a look at this. Maybe that's our problem. Object aperture 12.5. So yes, it did export it correctly, but apparently the values vary between the two programs. So we end up with a proper export. And if you don't want to use the depth of field as a static value imported, or as an animated value if you exported an animation, simply switch it off, get rid of any extra layers that you have. And now with Frischluft on your layer, you can very easily do focus pulls from very far to very close. Let's actually quickly animate it. Maybe we can move the focal point from back to front. Let's go all the way to 0 and render this thing. This shouldn't take long. I love multicore rendering. There's nothing quite like it. Maybe the preview looks a bit messed up while it's rendering, but it's just so much faster. Alright, and there we go. Look at this. A perfectly working depth mat without any quirks and without any problems. So as I said before, I'm not going to give you this Cinema 4D file or this After Effects setup. I mean, there's nothing really... Whoa, I hid all the programs. There's nothing really in here that you couldn't set up yourself. I'm just giving you the camera DoF, which you merge into your scene at the very beginning and work with this instead of the Cinema 4D camera. That's it. And you can do everything that you would do with a normal camera. It in fact is a normal camera. Let's switch it back to the C4D mode. Click on it to refresh it. Now that refresh is something we couldn't figure out how to solve. And you can see that if I go to the object, I can change my focal length, I can change the aperture width, I can change the field of view. I mean, all these settings work fine. Only the depth panel will not really listen to you. So as I increase the target distance and release it, it comes back. And visually you don't see it until you click it and it refreshes back. So this is just the way the espresso works. The preset works with both Cinema 4D 11.5 and 12, and I hope it will help you out. For QubaHQ tutorials, with the big help from Derya Ozturk, I'm Kuba Michalski and I'll see you next time.